magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for craftworldeldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about what Chapter Approved 2023, Arcs of Omen, means for Craftworld Eldar players in conjunction with recent updates to the balanced data slate and updated point values for units. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but the general takeaway is this. The way we build armies and how we think about scoring just got a major shakeup, as did the whole meta. There are totally new detachment rules to consider, major changes to secondary objective options, points increases for some of our key units, new CP considerations, that's command points for you newer players, as well as changes to aircraft rules, Harlequin data sheets, and rules for rival factions, all of which will affect the way that we build lists and play the game. To put it another way, the meta has just shifted enormously. So I'm going to talk about all of this. In addition to running you through all of the essentials in terms of what's changed, I will discuss how Craftworld players can best evolve lists and play styles to meet the demands of the new competitive landscape and the different resources available to us. I will say, before I dive into all of that, while some of my favorite content creators have pronounced Craftworlds amongst the biggest winners in this latest round of rules updates, I personally don't think that this is the case. There are several tactical and narrative benefits to the new rules for Space Elves, but overall, while I think the changes will be good for the game, streamlining list building, for example, the difficulty rating for Craftworlds probably just went up a little bit. The most impactful changes, in my opinion, are the ones to secondary objectives, and some of those have landed a little bit hard. But I'm going to save those for closer to the end of the video so that we can talk about them in the context of everything else that has happened. And just to be clear, this is not, it's no doom and gloom. Like, Craftworlds will still be good, Eldar are good, but I do think things might have gotten a little bit trickier with all of this. Let's start with the points updates, as well as general relevant data slate changes. And then I'll dive into new rules that require armies to consist of only a single unique detachment. So the new Arcs of Omen rule, you get that one Arcs of Omen detachment unless accompanied by a single Battle Brothers detachment, which is allies from a different faction. For us, that's Harlequins. Incidentally, if you missed that all other detachment types are now off limits, you are not alone. They put it in a weird place. Check page 1, paragraph 3 of the new mission pack, and you will see that it's not that Arcs of Omen is a new detachment that you can select. It is the only detachment that you can select. After talking about all of that, I will discuss changes to secondary missions. That, I think, is the most important part of this video. I'll talk about how those are likely to affect army building and tactics. And finally, I will conclude by reviewing the mostly minor changes to primary missions. That's going to be pretty quick, and what those mean for Space Elves. So here we go. Let's talk points updates. For the most part, it's not good news on the points front. Farseers and Farseer Skyrunners both went up by 10 points each. Warlocks and Warlock Skyrunners both went up by 5 points. The Singleton character Foot Warlock is now 45 points, while the Singleton Skyrunner Warlock remains at 65. So I'm pretty sure that's what it was before. So we dodged one little points increase there. Wraithguard with D-Scythes are 5 points more expensive now. The D-Scythe is now 10 points per model. Swooping Hawks got a 25% points increase to 25 points per model, while the Webway Gate went up to 100. We did get 2 points reductions, though. Dark Reapers went down to 135, and Shroud Runners went down to 30 from 35. Now, I admit to finding pretty much all of these totally perplexing. Craftworlds had an acceptably average win rate before, so what amounts to a new tax on essential units, that is Farseers and Warlocks, seems to me at least a little bit unnecessary and unwarranted. Maybe it's to keep them in step with changes to equivalent units in other factions. I don't know, but I was surprised by the increase to our core HQs. I'm also surprised by the increase to the D-Scythe, which was not exactly a common unit in well-performing tournament lists. There was one build that occasionally ran 7 of them effectively, and that's not even a full unit, so it's nowhere near like people were spamming Wraiths with D-Scythes. That was never a thing. So I'm a little surprised on that one. The change to Hawks might be partially intended to put the kibosh on the recently popular Swift Strikes / Masterful Shots list, which I'm not going to talk about it if you don't need. If you don't already know about it, it doesn't matter because I think it's dead now. But it was a list that was spamming sometimes as many as 25 winged aspect warriors. And this might be the only place where the changes actually make sense to me. My heart does. I feel bad for you, Swift Strikers people. I definitely do. I almost bought like 15. I have, I think, in my collection currently 15 Hawks. I almost bought 15 more, and I'm actually glad I didn't. But that's the only place where the change makes sense. Hawks were really good, perhaps one of the very best units, and especially with the changes to indirect fire and now the new changes to the aircraft rules, they are actually much harder to deal with than they were when our codex dropped. So I think it makes sense for them to have been nerfed. So I get that points bump. I would rather that than, they lose battle focus jumps or something. They're still going to be good. The points reduction, you're just not going to run 25 of them anymore. The points reduction for Shroud Runners, while welcome, seems weird to me. So the Shroud Runners were already in a really good place. They were a unit that was becoming increasingly common to include in competitive lists. And at 30 points, they're now almost the same cost per wound as bog standard Guardians, which is crazy because the bikes are faster, harder hitting, more durable, generally more awesome. And the other implication here is that scatter bikes are officially dead. Why would you pay 30 points for a 2-wound Windrider with a scatter laser when you could pay the same amount of points for a 3-wound Shroud Runner with a scatter laser, a long rifle, ballistic skill 2, a pre-game move, and the ability to use cover and a super cool mortal wound stratagem? I guess theoretically, if you were running a max size unit of Windriders, it could better make use of buffs, but the Shroud Runners essentially already have the equivalent buffs built in, so that's not exactly compelling. The takeaway here is if you don't already own some Shroud Runners, now is probably the time, and hopefully those of you who have scatter lasers on your Windriders either magnetize them or put them on with blue tack, or there's not a whole lot of glue on there, because it's hard to see why you would ever play with those now, except for fun narrative reasons. The increase in cost to the Webway Gate is presumably intended to compensate for the fact that it is now free to put units into reserve. No CP cost on that. I'll talk about that later. But the fact that most tournament boards make it impossible to place the Webway Gate advantageously, combined with the fact that, spoiler alert, Hidden Path, that secondary objective, has been eliminated, not in the game anymore, make the increased point cost, I think, as unwarranted as it is irrelevant, as nobody is going to run the gate anyway outside of casual narrative play. Lastly, while the decrease to Reapers is welcome, it's nowhere near enough to get them out of the penalty box. If they also got battle focus, maybe then we'd be talking, but that didn't happen. So that's it for points. Most competitive lists, as they are now, doesn't really matter because we're remaking our lists in light of the new rules, but your competitive list probably just went up to from between 50 to 75 points, assuming that you have a unit of Hawks and a standard loadout of HQs. Ironically, that's about how many points you might have saved by using the new detachment rules to avoid having to take one more unit of Rangers than you really wanted. As Farseers and Warlocks are essential, Hawks are still good. There really isn't a way to build around these changes. Our lists are just going to be down one relatively inexpensive unit from where they were before, or maybe you're getting rid of some upgrades or something. I don't know, but you have less. It's not that big a deal, but it does mean that we can stop celebrating how the new detachment rules allegedly eliminated the troop tax for Craft Worlds. For you newer players, troop tax refers to detachment rules that force you to take one or more units that you would not include in your list for tactical reasons, but the rules are making you include those units. In this case, a lot of people... Craft Worlds troops are not exactly like the envy of other factions, and so lots of people had one more unit than they really wanted of, say, Rangers. But it's not that we're getting something in place of those Rangers. With the points increases, you're just kind of losing that unit and not replacing it with anything. For those of you who were running 25 Hawks with Swift Strikes and Masterful Shots, these changes are list killers, and my sincere condolences. Since mid 8th edition, GW has a history of shutting down anything that starts appearing as a spam unit outside of the troops category. So I'm not surprised, but I still feel really bad for people who just invested a bunch of time and money in Hawks. That sucks. I've been there with units in the past. On the bright side, damn, Shroudrunners, you are looking pretty fine at 30 points. And just in case there are new players listening who do not already know, if you're where are these point values that you're talking about, Brent? GW no longer publishes updated point values in books that you have to buy with hard-earned currency. They're now free on the download section of the Warhammer community website in a document obscurely named the Munitorium Field Manual, which if I were a new player, I would not know that that's where I go for points. Do you think it's a bit unsporting to then increase the cost for the chapter approved book to almost equal the cost of what the two books before, when we used to also have to buy the point? But whatever, I'm happy. We do save some money, and I'm happy to have the point values for free. I think that's a good change. Okay, let's talk new rules. So there's a balance update that includes some rules changes, balance data slate update. Some of them pertain directly to Craft Worlds. Most of them are just sort of changes to the game, or they pertain to rival factions. I'm going to talk about everything that I think is relevant to us. The first one is putting units into strategic reserves is now free. I mentioned this earlier in passing. This is huge. It reduces the effectiveness of Alpha Strike lists tremendously, and it increases the value of durable units that can screen out table edges, because reserves can't come in anywhere outside of 9. They have to come in on edges. So, your wave serpents or your wraith infantry that can like march up the edge of the table and prevent your opponent from putting units from reserves into the midboard are extra useful. I think we're gonna have to think about that in list construction. Units that can both take fire from enemies and screen. Not typically a strength for Eldar getting shot, but we do have some units that can do it. But this also gives our opponents another tool for answering fast Eldari target elimination lists, and that is simply don't put your models on the table. This means we're going to need to think about unit trading a bit differently. We need to exercise a little bit more restraint probably with how we do that, because you don't want to overextend yourself and then have your opponent bring in all of these reserves and smack down your assault force in a disproportional way to the damage you inflicted. Also, here's a good change that this rule brings about. Small town tournament organizers who are still putting an amount of terrain on the table that reflects what the game looked like back when they themselves started playing in 5th edition, or maybe that was the last edition that they actually had time or interest in playing 40K. People who run game stores sometimes come to hate games. Those TOs are no longer peeing in the Cheerios with quite the same amount of asparagus in their urine when they don't put enough line of sight blocking terrain on the table. Because now, if you look at the table and you see that you're just not going to be able to hide your initial force, you can just hold back up to half of that force, and that'll probably help you work around that, which is good for fragile space elves who sometimes in those tournaments with the non-standard amount of terrain, if you didn't get first turn, that was basically game over, and that's no longer true, which is great. There are new aircraft rules. So aircraft now must start the game in strategic reserve, which from a narrative perspective, I get that. Like it's up there in the sky. It's not like hovering in your backfield. And they can no longer leave the field on the same turn in which they trigger any abilities, which is a huge smackdown to the Drakari bomber that some of us were using in our Ynnari lists, because you used to be able to pull that move where you flew over your opponent's units, you did a bunch of d6 damage, and then you disappeared before your opponent could, that was a great flyer, and I'm not sure that it really is anymore. The whole point of this rules change is to prevent units like the Drakari bomber from performing these devastating turn 1 alpha strikes that drop lots of mortal wounds on infantry without the opponent being able to do anything to prevent it. So now, because the aircraft has to come in from reserve, and when you do that, you can't move. It's just like coming in on the board within 6 inches of a table edge, and then it can shoot, but it can't move anywhere. This means that your opponent is guaranteed a full turn to deal with the aircraft, which doesn't benefit from obscuring terrain, so they're hard to hide before the aircraft can move. it's pretty devastating to aircraft. The Hemlock and the Crimson Hunter were already struggling to perform proportionally to their points in any Eldari list, and now they're even less likely to be able to do that. And the other thing is that Ynnari Alpha Strike is well and truly dead. Between the reserve rules and the loss of the aircraft, I don't think that Ynnari Alpha Strike list that I was so excited about a few months ago, I don't think any version of that still has play. I don't know if you're out there listening, Chase, but if you are, my heart goes out to you. I'm sure you're going to come up with something new and great, though. You're a great autarch, so no worries in the long term. On the other hand, now that our opponents don't have access to turn 1 air assault, our own fragile space elves are much safer on turn 1. I've always hated playing games against lists with multiple aircraft units because so much ends up depending on that first turn. I'm thinking about some Tyranids lists. There was a time when there was a particular AdMech build. There was a person in my local meta who's a great player. When he got first turn, if he had his 2 AdMech aircraft, could really mess up my backfield. I could mitigate some with Phantasm. So our opponents have lost a tool. That means we don't have to start as much stuff in transports. Our swooping hawks are just safe. They're just safe now in combination with the nerfs to indirect fire, which is another reason why I think that the points increase for the hawks makes sense. So there are advantages for us to the aircraft change. I think disproportionately so because we weren't really using our aircraft anyway. So I think that this is only good for us. But it also seems to me that GW still hasn't quite figured out a way to make aircraft really make sense and be balanced on the table. That's something I'm hoping for in 10th edition. Okay, another change. No more Armor of Contempt. It's gone. It's finished. This one is big. And I must say that I find this change both surprising and a little narratively disappointing, at least where Marines are concerned. It made sense to me that Space Marines should be able to stand in the open and really take a beating. This is good news for Space Elves and our competitive prospects. But I personally, despite not being and never having been a Marine player, I do play. I have some Emperor's Children, so I'm falsifying a little bit here. But I would have been in favor, Space Marine players, of you keeping your Armor of Contempt. Made sense to me. But the fact is that we, as Space Elf Autarchs and Farseers, no longer need to worry about big blocks of Terminators and cover simply shrugging off massed Shuriken fire. Some of the most obvious winners for Craft Worlds are basic Wind Riders, who are now an actual threat to all of those factions that were previously protected by Armor of Contempt. That 20-point Wind Rider model with its maneuverability and its pretty good fire output is a threat again. That's really good. There are big implications here for Craft World list construction, as we no longer need to meticulously plan for how we can get to the equivalent of AP-4 or even AP-5 with serious volume of fire in order to have a flexible army that can play against any list. It so much takes the pressure off of certain aspects of list construction. Now, I will mention that Space Marines got point reductions to compensate for the loss of Armor of Contempt, and Goonhammer did a really interesting stats breakdown on whether the change balanced out so that you can afford more wounds of models on the table, which means that losing out on Armor of Contempt doesn't constitute as big a nerf. Their conclusion was in all but the most specific and narrow circumstances, Marine players are either just as well off as they were before, and maybe even a little bit better off. We'll see if that turns out to be true in play, but Armor of Contempt is gone. Another big change is a nerf to our clown cousins. Harlequins got a serious slapdown, a faction-wide, hard smackdown with a universal -1 penalty to their invulnerable save. This is disappointing, even if you're not a primary Harlequins player, because it comes at the same time that we, as Asuryani Autarchs, can finally take the traveling player's combat patrol without a CP penalty. A change that I will explain when I get to the new detachment rules, but you can now have a single patrol of Harlequins running alongside of your Arcs of Omen Craft Worlds detachment and pay no CP for either one. So suddenly we can use Harlequins, but they're worse. The invuln reduction significantly alters what roles Harlequins might fill as allies in an Asuryani list. Previously, small numbers of Harlequins could be extremely durable for their points, especially as you could get, say, a troop that makes an advance move to a 3-up invuln save. The Solitaire could get like a 2-up, or started, I think, maybe even at 1. So that's gone. And because Craft Worlds already struggle with primary objectives, the loss of durable Acolytes of the Laughing God represents a real loss to the utility of an allied Harlequin force. Now, that said, Harlequins are still good for target elimination and contesting objectives with hard-hitting troops units, but only the second of those two things I just mentioned, that is contesting objectives with hard-hitting troop units, is a thing that we didn't already do well as Space Elves. So I think we can still use Harlequin allies effectively in competitive play, but they are now going to be much more one-dimensional than they would have been, which is a bummer. To put it another way, you can essentially get the same benefit by throwing Will of Azurion on a unit of Banshees to give them OBSEC as you could get from the primary thing that clowns are going to do for us in a list. We might still also be able to make decent use of a Shadow Seer. They have some good psychic powers. A Death Jester firing out of an open-topped transport is still pretty good, and there's some cool upgrades for them. But for the most part, Harlequin allies will consist of suicidal OBSEC melee units that trade themselves to mess up an opponent out of line of sight in the backfield and strip the objective that unit is standing on. But then nevertheless, your Harlequins will die before you can score the objective yourself, because now they're killed by a stiff wind, sneezing, chicken pox, mean girls looking at them at party. Like, they're not going to survive anything. So don't get me wrong, Harlequins are not a bad tool, and I love seeing Harlequins back in play as an allied option with actual potential. But I personally really would have liked to see GW find a different way to rein in the win rate on Killer Clowns rather than the faction-wide invul nerf that it seems to me strips them of some of their nuance. So I'm definitely going to experiment with traveling players, and I'm excited about that. But man, that gambling invuln and the whole concept of luck and everything with the Laughing God made so much narrative sense and was so fun. And now it's not really there. I mean, our Aspect Warriors already have a 5-up invuln, so it's just not that impressive. Okay. Last rules change. Fire and Fade. Fire and Fade is a 2 CP stratagem that lets you move a unit after shooting, much as you would with Battle Focus. But it instead automatically gives you a normal move of up to 7 inches instead of having to roll that d6. And this enables wily autarchs to duck a heavy support unit like a triplet Warwalker squad or a Fire Prism out of line of sight after shooting, or to guarantee that a single fragile unit that does have Battle Focus can move out of sight into a ruin. Because remember, moving into a ruin with Battle Focus subtracts 3 from your roll. So there's always like a 50% chance it won't work. The Fire and Fade had been in a previous data slate update limited to once per game, and now it's been restored to its original glory. And in combination with simply having more command points, more CP, because of the new detachment rules that I haven't talked about yet, this is a positive change. Terrain dense tables might still make getting the full value out of Fire Prisms a little difficult. You often just can't get a line of sight on anything in your opponent's backfield. But I think that Warwalkers with Bright Lances, for many reasons, might actually be back in as a solid competitive include. And the D cannons on platforms that were already popular, pushing forward with those a little bit more, I think they're going to have even more play. People were already using Fire and Fade once per game on those, and being able to pivot into it more than once is pretty awesome, even though it is pretty expensive in terms of CP. So this is a positive change. It's good for us. It's a rollback of a nerf that we probably never needed at a time when we're getting more CP, so we can make good use of it. Okay. The new detachment rules. Arcs of Omen. It's time to discuss those big changes to detachments and army construction that I teased at the beginning. Here's the crux of the major shakeup. Army lists now consist of a single, highly flexible detachment called an Arc of Omen detachment that can only be supplemented with a single Battle Brothers patrol or heavy auxiliary detachment. I think there's like one other option. Knights can get like an Inquisitor. But that Battle Brothers faction has to come from a specifically named different factions. So you can't bring your Arcs of Omen detachment and then a patrol of Craft Worlds and call them Battle Brothers. For Craft World Eldar, the only option is Harlequins. So you get your Arcs of Omen Craft Worlds detachment and then 0 to 1 patrols of Harlequins, all for free with no CP. It means that you start the game, but at least before you've spent any requisition points, with 6 CP. It is literally impossible now to spend CP on detachments, and everybody starts the game with 6 command points. I am hoping that maybe they meant to roll back the single Arcs of Omen detachment rule. Here's why I think there might be an argument for that. It's in the introduction to the book where it clarifies that one Arcs of Omen detachment means it's the only detachment that you can have. Nothing else is legal. But it also says on that same page that you start the game with 4 CP. And it's possible that I just misread it. I've only had this book for a day. But it could be that the reason that they don't make it more clear that you only get a single detachment on the next page is that they meant to roll back. So maybe we'll get some FAQ clarifying this. Maybe some of those other detachments are still legal, but I kind of suspect that maybe they're not, because I think part of the purpose of doing this is to streamline and simplify army construction. And so I kind of think probably we're looking at a new version of 40K in which you get the 1 detachment. The Arcs of Omen detachment requires a single HQ accompanied by any one of the following: 3 troops, 3 elites, 3 fast attack units, 3 heavy support units, or 3 Lords of War. So those are the compulsory slots. You need an HQ and you need 3 of something. And then in addition, the detachment may include up to 3 more of any of those, except for troops, where you can include up to 9 more. Additionally, you can have up to 2 aircraft and up to 1 transport for every infantry unit. But unlike before, transports must begin the game with infantry on board. So you can't include a Wave Serpent because you have at least 1 infantry and then not start anything in it. I don't think we were doing that. There were earlier editions where we pulled that. I don't think any Eldar players were doing it, but it will matter for certain other factions. So all of this has some interesting implications. For one thing, it's no longer necessary to include more troops than you really want or need. Troops still have the advantage of being the only thing that just natively has objectives secured, with few exceptions. But nevertheless, before this, many ambitious autarchs were utilizing 2 to 3 units of rangers, where 1 to 2 units might have been sufficient, which has led many elf enthusiasts to celebrate, prematurely I think, the end of the troop tax. We already established, though, that the new points costs mean that we might not actually be able to replace those rangers with anything at all. The other thing that I think makes this change somewhat irrelevant is, I think there's a reason when we get to talking about secondary objectives where a lot of us might actually want 3 ranger units in a way that we just didn't before. I'll talk about this later. So it makes that change even less significant for us. There are some distinct advantages, however. One, to the new detachment rules, is that it's really easy to fit 4 HQs into a list without having to give up CP. We have some really good HQs, and if you were running, say, 2 Farseers before and Baharath, and then you wanted some other character, maybe the Avatar of Cain, you couldn't do that unless you added a patrol detachment in and paid for it, and you don't have to do that now. So that's an advantage. We have really good stratagems as Craft Worlds players, and having more CP is a positive thing for us. There are some other advantages to Arcs of Omen detachments, both for competitive and casual play. For example, Wraith Knights are now includable without a CP tax, and multiple Wraith Knights, not just 1. And now they get Craft Worlds traits. They didn't before. You had to have 3 of them for them to get Craft Worlds traits. So you could have 1 or 2 Wraith Knights, and they would get Craft World subfaction bonuses, which is great. Corsairs might occasionally have an actual role to play, even in competitive games, as they are our cheapest available OBSEC unit. I don't think Wraith Knights are good now, or that we are about to see the rise of elf pirates as a competitive staple, but it is nice to see these underutilized models getting a little boost. All that said, there are some other implications here. For one thing, even though the Arcs of Omen detachment is the most flexible to date, overall, list construction is actually less flexible than it was before. For example, there is now simply no way to have both 4 fast attack units and 4 non-warlock elites from the same faction in the same list, which is just not that crazy a combo. Like if you had 2 units of Swooping Hawks and, I don't know, a Viper and some Shroud Runners before, and you also had 2 units of Banshees, a unit of Scorpions, and some Dire Avengers, there's no way to build that list now because you can't have 4 of 2 things. You just can't. You get up to 6 of 1 that's non-troops, and then everything else maxes out at 3. It's also not possible to ever have 5 HQs from the same faction, which, okay, I wasn't doing it a lot, but every now and then I did. There's no, you're not running in some fun casual game, if you're going to play with these rules, you're not running the Phoenix Court, for example. I don't know if anybody still does that, but the limit on HQs doesn't land hard for us, but it is going to land hard for some other, if you play Slaanesh Demons mono faction, for example, most of their best options are characters. So that's a bit of a blow to them. Another weird narrative side effect is that it's no longer legal to run Drukhari and Asuryani detachments in the same army, or even patrols from different craft worlds. Both were heavily discouraged already as doing so invalidated faction bonuses, but now it is simply impossible. It's no loss for competitive play, but nevertheless, it is a bit weird narratively. Obviously, in your local meta, when you're running a crusade or whatever, you agree on whatever you want. I just think it's weird that that's been totally excluded in the new rules. Last consideration, other factions too have now fewer restrictions on including super heavies and other Lords of War. But unlike Wraith Knights, theirs are actually really good in some cases. So we are probably going to see more big bad titans stomping around the battlefields of the 41st millennium, which means we need to consider adding more hard target elimination to our own rosters. So that's a consideration. I mentioned before, I think suddenly units of Warwalkers with 6 Bright Lances that can fire and fade might have some play. D-cannons are still good, but you're going to need additional ways, I think, to pick up hard targets. Although I'm a little annoyed by the limitations imposed on unit selection by the new rules, I have to admit to thinking that overall they're good for the game. Players new to 40k have been faced in the past not only with an avalanche of complex rules to learn, but a mere maze of complex choices, some of which arguably don't add a lot of tactical nuance to the game. Not having to choose what detachments to use, as well as no longer being required to choose relics and warlord traits. That was true in the last chapter approved. They're not automatic. They're things you buy, so you could just not think about it the first time you're making a list. All of that lowers the barrier to entry. Sid Meier of Civilization fame famously said that good game design is about giving players interesting choices, which is something that 40k does do in spades, but nevertheless, some of the choices required to create and play an army on the table up until now make the game more complex without making it more tactically nuanced. And so I think the old detachment rules probably went in that bag. This is all probably for the best, even though I'm a little salty about my 4 fast attack and 4 elites, but whatever. Okay, secondaries. I said early in the video that I think the biggest, most important changes for Craft World players are around secondary objectives. So let's talk about that. It's huge. Some of the most popular tournament lists in the second half of 2023 were these Ulthwé lists that focused on keeping their heads down, controlling their own half of the table, playing primarily for points, and those lists are not viable anymore for reasons. And on the other hand, the most popular alternative build in recent months to that Ulthwé build I was just talking about, the Swift Strikers / Masterful Shots lists, I already mentioned, are totally hamstrung by the 25% increase to Swooping Hawks. And this means it's time to regather the Council of Autarchs and totally rethink our war hosts, which is, to be fair, one of the most fun parts of 40k. The game eventually becomes stale if the same lists continue to dominate the meta, or only one list is viable from a particular faction. So here are the most relevant changes for us to secondaries. I have, let's see, I've got like, I don't know, 4 or 5 of these to talk about. But number 1 is Psychic Interrogation got a massive nerf. It now requires line of sight. For you newer players, Psychic Interrogation was the secondary where one of your Space Elf wizards pops out and just like gets within 24 inches, doesn't even have to see an enemy HQ, and raids their mind for information with a warp charge value of 4. And every time you did this, you could score 3 points. So if you did it every turn, you could get 15. And we have a stratagem that lets us perform a psychic action but still cast something. It was really good. And it will still be good against lists with very aggressive HQs that you don't absolutely need to kill. But it will probably not be, Psychic Interrogation will probably not be an almost compulsory pick for craft worlders anymore. You may be able to work around this a little bit using the Quicken combo that I've described in previous videos, where you move a Psyker on a jet bike 22 inches, perform a psychic action, like I psychically interrogate you, I just zipped into your back, I can see you now, I zipped behind your ruin, and then you cast Quicken on the Psyker and flee 22 inches back to safety. And you can make it, I think, 30 inches if you use the Sunstorm relic. But even that might not be enough to overcome your opponent's ability to simply hide and screen HQs. It's hard hitting for us simply because you generally need a way to score 15 points on at least one secondary per turn, or per game, and this one was that for a lot of players. I would say in at least half my games, I was getting to 15 on this, and I don't think that's going to happen anymore. Okay. Second change. Warp Ritual now has a warp charge value of 4 instead of 3. Ooh. This is mostly irrelevant. It's not like we're going to not succeed on that cast. The bigger issue with getting off a psychic cast is the possibility of being denied. So the warp charge value doesn't really matter. You can still guarantee success with Strands of Fate dice. I do think Warp Ritual is going to be more popular now simply because Psychic Interrogation is harder to pull off. The advantage to Psychic Interrogation was that ability to get to 15. But the advantage to Warp Ritual is if you can do it just 3 times, you get to 12. You are capped at 12. But that frees up resources to do other things on other turns. And I guess I should have reviewed for newer players. Warp Ritual is a psychic secondary that requires you to place a model close to the center of the table, perform this psychic action, and then run away. You don't need to control the center of the table. If there's an objective there, you do not need to control the objective. You just have to get somewhere near it with your Psyker, perform this pretty easy to perform action, and run away. And that Quicken combo I just mentioned before makes it possible for you to do this without risking one of your Space Elf casters. And the Ulthwé Ghost Helm on a 9 still is undeniable. So if you use a Strands die, it has to be an unmodified 9. But if you use a Strands die, you have a 2 out of 3 chance that cast will be undeniable. I still think that this is going to be one of these psychic picks, and in most games it's going to be Warp Ritual, is going to be a go-to for Space Elves. But I think the only reason that it's likely to be Warp Ritual now is that Psychic Interrogation got worse. It's going to be a small loss to our scoring, but there is I guess a small resource gain in terms of having to cast fewer times. Number 3, this is the real big one. Hidden Path is gone. Like, gone. Not reimagined, not nerfed, just swallowed up by the warp like so many Monkai in the blast radius of a D cannon. This is a significant change, and in combination with changes to Psychic Interrogation, it means that Craft Worlds lists that rely on only controlling their own half of the table and punishing opponents for crossing the midline might no longer be able to score highly enough to compete outside of mid-level play. Those Ulthwé lists that I mentioned earlier routinely scored 15 points on this one about 75% of the time, because you get the points you use. Doesn't matter. Hidden Path's gone. I'm not going to explain, but you frequently could get to 15 points with it. Now it's gone. This means we need to significantly rethink list construction with reference to a totally new plan for secondary scoring, because in general, you want to be able to get with your combined score for primaries and secondaries fairly reliably, if things go more or less according to plan, into the 90s, so that when you have a really tight matchup against somebody who's better than you or as good as you and has a really good list, you still do pretty well. And without 15 points for Hidden Path in a lot of games, we just have to totally rethink how we're building and playing. But there is some good news. In contrast to the nerfs that I just talked about for the old standbys, a few other historically popular options for Galactic Knife Ears did just get a bit of a boost. Behind enemy lines got better. I think that this is the biggest silver lining to all of these changes. The way behind enemy lines works is if you have units in your opponent's deployment zone, they don't have to perform an action, they don't have to do anything, you score points just for having them there. Now, if just one of your units is in your opponent's actual deployment zone at the end of the turn, you score 3 VP instead of 2. And if you have 2 units, it gets you 4 VP. And this is really good for Space Elf players because we have so many fast units. And the fact that opponents might be starting more units in reserve now, because remember, reserves are free, will have the side effect of freeing up space in your opponent's backfield to score behind enemy lines. So your opponent will be caught with like 2 bad options. I could hold more things in reserve, which has advantages against a fast, hard-hitting army, but then we're scoring, or they could try to block out the backfield, but then they're there to be targets for our fast, hard-hitting elves. So that's a super positive change. Units like Striking Scorpions and Howling Banshees and Shining Spears, and even those Suicidal Harlequin allies that I mentioned earlier, will be able to help you score behind enemy lines while performing their usual duties, which is unit trading. And that's what you want when selecting secondaries. You want to pick missions that will let you score big without pulling resources away from other tasks. So in theory, also, because behind enemy lines is now worth 3 with only a single unit, you can get to 15 on this one simply with 1 aggressive, deep punching unit trade per turn, which we already kind of wanted to do in a lot of lists. So behind enemy lines might very well become one of the competitive staples for autarchs everywhere going forward. I kind of think it's going to. All right. Engage on all fronts. Also got an update. Once the darling of the competitive scene, then a pariah is perhaps back now, sort of, maybe. And units now only need to be 3 inches instead of 6 inches from other table core. Oh, I should just explain how this works. Again, new players are listening to this. So engage on all fronts. If you have a unit in every quadrant of the board, but now at least 3 inches from every other quadrant of the board, at the end of your turn, you score 3 points. If you have units in at least 3 quadrants of the board, but now they have to be, if you're only in 3 quadrants, 6 inches from any other quadrant, you score at the end of your turn 2 points. It's pretty good. What it means is that it's pretty easy now, if you're going to score 4, right, to move a unit from a scoring position in one quadrant of the table to a scoring position in another quadrant of the table in a single turn reliably. And you also don't need to be spreading out your vulnerable space elves as much to pick up points for this one. Theoretically, if you could hold the center of the table with durable units like the Avatar and some Wraith Infantry, you could make this a really solid pick for games in which your opponent isn't bristling with target elimination. I still think that Engage is going to be maybe a slightly more marginal pick than some of these others, but it's not terrible. It is an option, and there might be rare games in which it's a better pick than behind enemy lines. So here's what I think the overall takeaway is, and I think that this thing that I'm about to say, or the things that I'm about to say, are probably the most important part of this whole video with reference to competitive play going forward. Here it is. I don't know about the rest of you, but my own previous go-to combo for most maps and missions was Hidden Path plus Psychic Interrogation, or in some cases Warp Ritual, and then either Scout the Enemy or a Kill the Objective if one presented itself. And I think that's Ashes now. So the question is, where do we go for here? Scout the Enemy from here. Scout the Enemy remains unchanged and it's still good. And for you newer players, what Scout the Enemy is, it's one of the action-based secondaries. So essentially, there are different categories of secondaries you get. You can take one psychic one board control one that rewards you for spreading out. That's behind enemy lines. One that involves performing an action, and then there are 2 categories for killing stuff. And Scout the Enemy is a performing actions one. If you have to be, I think, 6 inches from your own deployment zone, and if you perform this action with a unit of Rangers specifically, it finishes at the end of your turn. If it's with any other unit, it finishes at the end of your opponent's turn, and you score 2 points if you do it anywhere in the midfield, 6 inches from your deployment zone, and you score 4 points if you can pull it off in your opponent's backfield. That remains really good. Historically, it's like guaranteed you could get to 10 with this, and then in some games, if it went well, you could get to 12 or maybe even 14 or 15. I usually found myself getting to 10 or 12. It was my third. It's still good. So I think we're still going to be picking Scout the Enemy. Many of us were expecting that Wrath of Cain, our unique killy one, would get a much needed bump. Perhaps we would get 2 points for a melee kill and 2 points for a shooty kill, and the avatar would count like an aspect. None of that happened. Wrath of Cain has remained the same. It's still usable in occasional matchups for certain lists, but it's not a staple. So of what we were using before, we're sitting on Scout the Enemy. Where does that leave us? And my guess is it leaves us here. Scout the Enemy, Warp Ritual, and Behind Enemy Lines are probably going to be the most common picks going forward, supplemented occasionally with killy objectives when one of those is likely to yield more points than one of the three I already named, because your opponent is running, I don't know, Knights or something, and you know you have to kill their whole list to win, and you're going to max out, bring it down. In the competitive meta, though, I suspect that this means that what we are going to see is a shift back to extremely aggressive Craft Worlds lists with lots of small, efficiently pointed units that want to get into the opponent's backfield and trade themselves for something while helping to score behind enemy lines, and then just out-trade the opponent, such that in turns 4 and 5 of the game, you have like 400 points of your army left, or 500, and they have 300 or 400 points of theirs, but what you have is just more tactical and more useful than what they do. That's historically, Craft Worlds have sometimes played that way, and I think that that is going to be the style of play most rewarded. Now, there's been a bit of chatter online about one possible combo that might be a super strong pick for matchups against opponents who struggle to control their own backfield in the later half of the game, or 4 lists that can make your opponent struggle to control the backfield in the later half of the game, and it works like this. You select both Behind Enemy Lines and Scout the Enemy. New players, Behind Enemy Lines, you score for just having units in your opponent's backfield. Scout the Enemy, you score for performing actions in the midfield, and you score big for performing actions in your opponent's backfield. And it finishes at the end of the turn if that unit performing the action is a ranger unit. So you select Behind Enemy Lines and Scout the Enemy, and you include 3 units of rangers. Remember I said there's a reason to want 3 rangers now? You deploy the rangers somewhere, but then you use Phantasm to pick all 3 up and put them into reserve. Now, because Phantasm occurs after the first battle round has begun, as specified on the strat itself, units put into reserve in this way are not subject to auto-destruction if they do not arrive by turn 3. As per the rule, and I quote, does not apply to units that are placed into strategic reserves after the first battle round has started. There is simply no question that rangers that you pick up with Phantasm and put into reserve for free have been put into reserve after the first battle round has started. There's no room for argument on that, which means that if you pick up 3 units of rangers and put them into reserve, you do not need to put them on the table by turn 3. So here's what that means. In the latter half of the game, when your opponent's army is depleted, at least somewhere in their own backfield, you could drop a ranger unit into your opponent's backfield for big secondary scoring every single turn, 3, 4, 5. So you would score 3 just for having that 1 ranger unit in the backfield and nothing else, plus an additional 4 if they then perform Scout the Enemy. So even if that's the only thing you get back there, that's 7 points of secondaries per turn, 3, 4, and 5, which if your opponent is not in a position to screen, just fundamentally cannot prevent, which could be quite powerful. This is another reason why I think units like Scorpions and Banshees and Spears and trading units of Harlequins, these fast, hard-hitting trading units are going to be valuable because they're going to help you make that space early in the game so you can make this play later in the game. And while units like Scorpions and Banshees are running into your opponent's backfield and killing stuff, they're also scoring behind enemy lines early in the game, which will help you get to 15 with that. However, in order to shore up your ability to score on your opponent's backfield, those scouts and melee assault units are going to need support from other fast units like Vipers and Hawks and Spiders, anything on a bike. Even Wave Serpents or durable units like the Avatar or Wraiths with Ghost Axes quickened into the opponent's backfield, maybe on turn 2 or 3 and then buffed with durability to just be there as a problem. I think all of those are going to be viable. They're all going to have a lot of play, and you're definitely going to need fallback options if your opponent screens the Rangers or something goes wrong with the Scorpions or whatever. Whatever happens, I think it's going to be a lot of fun to rethink our lists, and what we pivot into might turn out to be much more dynamic and exciting than those conservative Ulthwé lists that many of us were running before. I certainly was. I think what's guaranteed after this chapter approved is that for Craft World players, victory will often depend on whether we can either out-trade our opponents or hit hard enough on turn 2 or 3 that a proportional retaliation might just not be possible. I don't know that Beltane will suddenly become a more competitive, viable Craft World, but I do suspect that the Beltane spirit of ruthless elimination over duck and cover tactical scoring is probably what the meta will demand of us until the next chapter approved comes along. Okay, so that's secondaries. Those are the big changes. Lots of consideration for list building. But before I wrap up here, I will talk for just a moment about some minor changes to primary missions and scoring. Here are the things that every Autarch needs to know about the new rules for the primary missions. Most of the primaries have remained totally unchanged, and those that did change received changes that are so minor that in some cases they just don't really merit talking about. The only really meaningful ones that I see for Craft World players are that it is now much easier to score primary points in the Scouring because the mission action completes at the end of the player turn, not at the end of the round. That's good for Space Hulls everywhere. We often struggle to max out our primaries, so whenever there is a progressive primary scoring option that does not involve controlling objectives in the mid or your opponent's backfield, that's usually good for us. It makes it easier for us to get where we need to at that score. The other changes to Abandoned Sanctuaries, which I think was one of the most brutal missions for us before and is even more so now, because Abandoned Sanctuaries now, you may remember, it used to prevent you from forward deploying. So units that can deploy in the midfield, like Rangers, just can't do that. That's still true, but now Abandoned Sanctuaries also prohibits units like Falcons from showing up in the first battle round outside of a player's deployment zone. You might still be able to drop a Falcon at the edge of your own deployment zone on turn 1 and pop some Banshees out 3 inches forward of it, and then use Fate dice for both an advance and a charge in combination with Ghost Walk to reach the opponent and get that behind enemy lines on turn 1 and do some damage. Maybe. But none of that changes the fact that this mission seriously hamstrings Alpha Strike lists in an even bigger way than before, and might cause you to seriously reconsider something like Behind Enemy Lines. This could be one of those missions where something like Engage on All Fronts is where you have to turn. The map just makes it really easy also for your opponent to screen Deep Strikers out of her backfield. And so I think on this one, potentially Behind Enemy Lines is a real trap. So that's something to consider. And there it is. That's all I have to say about primaries. I think, so that's it. That's all the stuff. The points changes, the changes to the rules, the changes to secondaries, the new detachments, the changes to primaries, and it all amounts to a big shakeup to the meta. And I think that there is always a temptation when new rules upend current lists to throw up our hands and declare ourselves the victims of cosmic injustice. And I will admit that what seemed to me to be harsh changes to those secondaries did initially leave me a bit reeling. That said, I think it's important to remember that we are not the only faction for whom the game has changed in a big way. And so whether it's actually a bit harder to play elves, as I suggested earlier, remains to be seen. That's kind of my intuition, but it might turn out to not be true. Because some of the most meta-dominant factions in the game, namely Tyranids and Chaos Space Marines, have been nerfed so hard, and in combination with other changes and the disappearance of Armor of Contempt, we might find that Space Elves are more competitively viable as before, even if we are scoring a little bit less. They just play differently. Here's the other thing. One of my favorite things about new chapter approved rules is that they force us to rethink lists and tactics, which helps to keep the game fresh and new. And I know that it can be daunting, especially for new people who just finished getting their heads around a particular play style for the first time. But at least in my opinion, the overall direction of 40K over the last 2 editions has been enormously positive, and coming up with new and dynamic ways to build lists and do battle in the grimdark ruins of the 41st millennia is part of what the hobby is all about. So yeah, the meta is really different, and we're facing some challenges we weren't facing before, but we also have some opportunities that we didn't have. The whole competitive landscape will be different, and it's going to be really exciting to figure out what that means and how best to move forward. So that's it. That's what I've got. I hope to be back soon with a new unit focus video, and again with some initial thoughts on that new Boarding Actions standalone 40K game that I talked about in my Farseers report. Until then, if you liked this video, I hope that you will click like. If you have not yet subscribed, I hope that you will consider subscribing. And for those of you who would like to obtain early access to videos and join my patrons on our private Discord, I would be delighted if you would consider becoming a patron and supporting the channel that way. I will include a link in the video description. So that's it. Hope to see you all again soon. Best of luck in your next campaign. I hope that in the comments below, you will tell me some of your own thoughts on Arcs of Omen, maybe share some ideas about list construction, or just say hello to help out the algorithm. Thanks, guys. Take care.